In 4.5 years, Britain had lost 1 million men. Never before had there been such slaughter.
The shock to the system, the national system of the First War, had really gone very, very, very deep. It's almost impossible now, looking back, to think how deep it had gone. But that was the truth of the matter. And the trench warfare of the last 4 years of the First War had really bitten into everybody's soul. And they remember, of course, there was to be no more war. It was the war to end all wars.
All quiet on the western front, so peaceful now.
It's been such a horrible war. The people that got killed, I mean, our own personal example, my mother lost her 2 brothers, the one 19 in the Somme, and Uncle Alf, who was a regular soldier, had just come home from India. Well, he didn't get home, actually. They diverted him to France, and he went through the battles, early battles and that, and he got killed. And such a lot of people went. I mean, such a lot of young men were killed, and the Somme and that I think people were really horrified and thought they'd never have another war. People really didn't want it.
Quiet on the western front, please God, let it stay that way.
In those days, Britain was a superpower. The Union Jack flew proudly over 1/5 of the surface of the globe. Her imperial possessions contained 1/4 of the world's population. But the war had brought her close to bankruptcy. To fight the war, Britain had mobilized 5 million men. All but a few were discharged. Despite the demands of imperial defense, there was no money to maintain large armed services. And besides, Britain, like other victorious powers, was determined to disarm, especially now that no conceivable enemy existed. The army was the first to be emasculated. To justify the cuts, the government adopted what it called the 10-year rule, an assumption for the purposes of military planning that peace would last at least 10 years. The Navy, Britain's guardian of the imperial sea lanes, was drastically diminished. By the start of the 1930s, Britain was a weaker naval power in relation to her rivals than she had been since the 17th century, when her fleet had been defeated by the Dutch. Britain's most modern service, the Air Force, was all but grounded.
When the First World War ended, the Royal Air Force was both the largest individual air force in the world and the only independent air force in existence. It had 22,000 aircraft on charge, 1,600 of them in actual action on the Western Front. And then dramatically, in 2 years, it had reduced from that 22,000 on charge to only 120 serviceable aircraft in the whole of the Royal Air Force. Tremendous drop. And aircraft, of course, were being scrapped, chopped up, burned in every direction. You could buy a SE-5 fighter for £5 and a 504 trainer for joyriding for 10.
Weakened by disarmament, the British put their trust in the League of Nations, set up at Geneva. The League was to settle disputes by arbitration, and in the last resort would fall back on what it called collective security. In extreme cases, this meant joint military action by member nations. But Britain's immediate concern was the preservation of its highly vulnerable empire. By the 1930s, she was scarcely strong enough to protect even the British Isles against a threat from Europe, and that was only a first commitment. Another lay along the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, on the sea lane to the brightest jewel in the imperial crown, India. Further east, and dangerously exposed, were Burma, Malaya, Hong Kong. The empire was hugely overstretched. But an even greater threat was emerging much nearer home, in Europe.
Hitler gets a tremendous ovation when leaving for his first cabinet meeting.
Hitler came to power on a promise to tear up the peace treaties and restore Germany's role as a major power in Europe. In principle, the British were sympathetic. There was a widespread feeling that Germany had been treated too harshly after the war.
From across the way, Hitler appeared at his window, and another milestone is marked in Germany's political history.
I think people were concerned, but I can't say that they felt alarmed at that stage. I think there was a certain feeling in the country that the Germans, one thing they do is love playing at soldiers. And as they had no soldiers, they took the brown shirts and the Nazi movement as a good alternative. But I don't think anybody suspected that they would break out into something as terrible as they did.
To the British government, a coalition of the Conservative, Labour and Liberal parties, the threat building up abroad was a long way off. The only pressing concern was the desperate state of Britain's economy, the result of the World Depression.
The threats that were building up abroad were rather remote, but the economic crisis was immediate. Something had to be done almost overnight. Otherwise, we were told, not just by fools and people who wanted to frighten us, but by the leading economists, the financial correspondents of every newspaper, appalling crisis is going to affect the British people, which will have dreadful effects. That was an immediate thing, and therefore, for the time being, all the intention was concentrated on that problem, rather than on the developing European situation with its threat of war.
The wartime government had promised the survivors of the fighting a country fit for heroes to live in. The pledge was not fulfilled. Industry had lost ground to foreign competition, and in the early 1930s, 1 in 5 of the working population was unemployed. Millions of families lived in abject poverty.
So you saw real hunger. I mean, I've been really hungry. I'm not talking about starving in the sense of peoples of Africa, but I've known hunger pangs and not known where the next meal was coming from. And I've seen the desperation on my mother's face as to how she was going to feed 5 children and a husband. We used to go out and buy 4 penn'orth of scrag end of lamb, and with that my mother would make a big succulent stew which would last us 2 or 3 days. And I can remember coming home from school one day being really very hungry, and there on the stove was this big stew. And my mother put a lid on it and started taking it out of the house. And I said, "Where are you going?" She said she was going to give it to Mrs. Bushell a little further down the road. And I said, "But I'm hungry." And I remember she slapped my face. She said, "You're hungry, but they are starving."
The strong man of the cabinet was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Neville Chamberlain. At heart, he was a social reformer, dedicated to uplift, prosperity and beating the Depression. Chamberlain's priorities were soon to be upset. In 1934, a high-level government committee reviewed the state of Britain's defences. The report recommended greater spending on defence and the creation of an expeditionary force able to fight on the continent. It drew attention to German rearmament and identified Hitler as the ultimate potential enemy. In 1935, Hitler had been in power for 2 years, and the resurgence of German militarism was causing unease. Nevertheless, the peace movement in Britain commanded mass support for its campaign against war. Propaganda films denounced rearmament.
I'd fight tomorrow if I thought a war would end war, but that's what they told my father in 1914, and we're no better off now.
When there's a quarrel between 2 people, the police are called in to settle it. Why can't the League of Nations be strong enough to settle disputes between 2 nations?
I was in the last war, and I thought that was going to be the end of it. Now, here we are again, back exactly where we started. Why can't the governments of the world get together to make war impossible?
Write to your MP.
The peace movement launched a successful petition.
We got over 11 million signatures for the peace petition, which is a significant number of the adults in this country. And that was the first beginning, I think, of the movement which was then to take over the 30s feeling against war. The fear was there, ticking away like a bomb all through the 30s. I think the peace petition began to make people feel and think about it. There we were marching and fighting to stop war, to demand that the government should form a pact with Russia and others to stop Hitler. And yet at the same time in our hearts, I think there was a realization that the machinery was in motion, it couldn't be stopped, that bomb was going to explode one day.
Neville Chamberlain urged the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, to come out for limited rearmament. But 1935 was an election year, and Baldwin was careful to reassure the voters.
Above all, we desire to go on working to maintain world peace and strengthen the League of Nations. But it is clear from recent events that both our own influence in the world and that of the League itself will be weakened unless we make good the gaps in our defenses. I will never stand for a policy of great armament, and I give you my word, and I think you can trust me by now, that our defense program will be no more than is sufficient to make our country safe and enable us to fulfill our obligations. That much we must have.
When Italy invaded Abyssinia, the need to strengthen Britain's defences became indisputable. Italy had been an ally, and Mussolini's friendship was vital to British control of the Mediterranean and thus to the Empire's defence. A further threat now developed in Germany, where Hitler marched 3 battalions of the Wehrmacht into the Rhineland. It was a clear breach of treaties, but it was not unexpected. Britain and France had spent months discussing their response. In the event, they did nothing. In the words of Anthony Eden, given Germany's strength and power of mischief in Europe, it was in Britain's interest to conclude a settlement with Hitler while he was still in the mood. It was a classic definition of appeasement.
I think that we should have stopped Hitler probably when he invaded the Rhineland. But there was a feeling in Britain certainly that the peace treaty had treated Germany unjustly. There was rather reluctance, therefore, to intervene on that particular issue. The French showed no sign of intervening whatever. And so I think the hope was, and again, it was a false hope, that if Hitler was allowed to reoccupy the Rhineland, that would be sufficient, and that would be the end of his demands. That feeling was wrong.